Good morning, wanderers and fellow adventurers, and welcome to the next devlog for Daemon Change. I'm going to be altering my format just a little bit and introducing a kind of formula to how I present information in these videos. My hope is that by doing so, it will streamline my video editing process, which in turn will create a bunch of benefits that I can hopefully go over next week. But having said that, we're going to be kicking off this video with my quest for the week. And the quest this time was to create a combat system for Daemon Change, which was actually going surprisingly well. I'm very used to encountering problems and issues and not knowing how to do anything and everything being just a complete fustercluck. So I was quite happy that the combat system was just working, like as intended. At least for the first few days. It does seem that right after I started, I actually abandoned my quest entirely. I have not completed the combat system. It is in no way usable right now. And in fact, I haven't even looked at combat in over a week. This is because in our Discord server, the Adventurers Lodge, I had a conversation with some of the Wanderers that went a little something like this. So yeah, my goal is to have the game kind of look like this. Oh, you mean you want it to look like this? No. I want the game to look like this. Oh, of course you want the game to look like this. No. It's going to look like, oh, like this? No, here, let me show you real quick. And that was the word I used, real quick, except that real quick took basically 2 weeks to do. It was a good 2 weeks, and I've made something really cool that I'm kind of proud of, and there's a lot that it can do given the right circumstances. I just didn't mean to look at my calendar at some point and realize, oh, it's taken me so long that I now need to make a new devlog that isn't going to be about combat. But here we are. So instead of combat, let me explain what I made instead. First, a reminder. This is an anime called Grimgar of Fantasy and Ash. Now, we talked about it in the first devlog, link to that in the top right. This anime, in a lot of ways, is kind of my aesthetic goal. I want my game to be a color and mood-rich environment that feels almost otherworldly and dreamlike. Note that, despite the fact I'm taking inspiration from an anime, my goal is not to recreate the anime style. Games like Guilty Gear do that plenty already, and they do a wonderful job at it. Personally, I've never been a big fan of cel-shaded graphics, and I say that even despite the fact that I ended up using cel-shading techniques in the system I created this week. No, the thing I want to create or capture from Grimgar specifically is the amount of color in each shot and the fantastical feel that comes from having done so. So the first step in accomplishing that quest was creating the day and night cycle. Cool, done, easy. Once I had created the day-night cycle, the next step would be to add in a system that could change the qualities, color, and intensity of the sun and moon as time passed, which is also done because that was built into how the day-night cycle worked. Which means that after that, the next thing is alter the manner in which light interacts with surfaces, the surfaces it hits, as it makes its way back to the viewer's eyes. And that's the step we're on right now. And it's what I spent the past 2 weeks trying to figure out because it's complicated. I'm going to do my absolute best to summarize a really complex and nuanced idea as concisely as possible. So in the world we live in, which is a world that now has things like AI-generated art, the artist's job is not to create the most lifelike thing possible. That hasn't been the artist's job for hundreds of years now, basically since the camera was first invented. The artist's job is, and has been, to do whatever it is that real life can't do, and to do so aesthetically. Looking at just this one image from Grimgar, it's not that the lighting in this is realistic. It's that a team of people worked really hard to make it unrealistic and very aesthetic. So for my game, it's not going to be enough that I can make the sun blue. I need to take that idea much further. I need to make it so that a blue sun can shine blue light on a white surface and it reflects any other color I choose, like red if I want it to. If it sounds like that doesn't make any sense, that's because it doesn't. That's not how light works, and that's exactly why it was really hard to make. The reason why I wanted to break the laws of physics here is because of a technique called hue shifting. That is hue shifting in a pixel art sense, by the way, not hue shifting in Unreal. That's something else. And I think painters have a different term for it as well. There's a lot of inconsistency across mediums, but the basic premise of why I want to break light physics is this. Let's say I have a pretty green color. Maybe it's like some grass or a woolen blanket or something like that. Now I want to add a sense of realism and weight and depth to this color, so I decide that I'm going to give it some highlights and some shadows. Now the question is this: how do I do that? Think about it for a second. You might come to the conclusion, well, add white where it's bright and where you want highlights, and then add black to where you want shadows, which is a really obvious way to go about it. That's what I was taught to do as a kid. It makes sense, and so that must be the best way, right? Wrong. It's a terrible way to go about it. It looks ugly and it's ineffective. And it took me years to learn that there was a better way, a more aesthetic way, and that was even after I had gotten out of art school. So what is the better way? Well, without going into the science of it, because there is a lot of fancy science going on here, all you need to know is that brighter things tend to shift up into the yellow spectrum of colors, and shadows tend to shift down into the blue spectrum of colors. Ish. That's a really broad oversimplification, but it's all you really need to know for this example. So looking at our green strip here, instead of adding pure white to one end and pure black to the other end, we're going to shift the green up towards different hues, a hue shift as it were, by adding a really bright yellow to one end and a really dull blue to the other, and then we'll compare the two strips. It's subtle, but very important. How important? Well, here's a black and white picture of Muhammad Ali. Aside from being a really cool historic photograph, it's also a good photograph, and I mean really good. It's got great composition, it's capturing an intense moment, and it has an incredible range of black and white colors inside of it. So if we take our green gradient that only uses black and white, and then map the lights to lights and darks to darks using a technique called gradient mapping, we end up with something kind of like this, which is, it's all right, it's fine, very green. Compare that though with the other gradient, the one that goes from blue to green, or from blue-green to yellow-green, and you get this instead. It's different now, but definitely a step in a better direction. Maybe much more like an old photograph or a forgotten memory. But why stop there? Let's take that green and really start to shift the colors around. So using that same technique called gradient mapping, I'm going to add in some even darker blues, a brighter yellow, a splash of red near the top, and a deep purple near the bottom. After a few minutes of moving colors around, I get this instead. And this is cool. The important thing to take away from basically everything I've said is that color does not go from bright to dark. Color moves around and changes and shifts, and most of the time it doesn't even make sense. In Grimgar, it really doesn't make sense, and yet it feels so wonderful because it doesn't make sense. So in my game, I wanted to create a system that let me hue shift the shadows and highlights of my scene, which brings us to this week's big boss, which was using gradient mapping in Unreal Engine. Gradient maps are a powerful thing. They're very cool, and I'm excited to use them, but astoundingly, it seems fucking no one uses gradient mapping in any games anywhere. You know what I spent these 2 weeks doing? Looking for tutorials, articles, videos, and archived threads that just didn't exist. Hardly anyone seems to use gradients regularly outside of some indies in their pet projects, such as myself. So finding out how to use gradients in a weird and unorthodox way as a shader was absolutely the most difficult challenge I had in all of this. It sucked. Fortunately, like 5 days ago or something, I found a tutorial from over 10 years ago that sent me to a different, even older tutorial that taught me half of what I needed to know. I was able to take that information, manipulate it, and then tie that to a different set of tutorials I found for Unity of all things. And then after all of that, here was how I beat the big boss. Take the entire scene, desaturate it, and then use that data with a base color key in order to create a true luminosity grayscale. This is basically what the game looks like if you're looking at just the light and literally nothing else. Next, divide all of this data into two separate components based off of its screen space luminosity. The first is taking all of the values above a certain threshold and then setting them aside. So this looks pretty normal, as these are all of the highlights in the scene. The second thing to do was take all of the values below a certain threshold and then do the exact same thing. And this probably looks pretty bizarre. If the last image was only the highlights highlighted, then this scene you could describe as being only the shadows highlighted. And it was actually really important that I set this up this way because both sets of data are going to be used as masks. For what? Well, going back to the grayscale and applying those masks, I can use a node called the curve atlas row parameter, which is a node I definitely didn't know existed before this whole process, to map out those specified sections of the scene to a predetermined gradient. Then I took all that altered colored information of the highlights and shadows and interpolated it back into the unaltered colors of the default lit scene. Which is only half the problem, because then I had to create a gradient map that corresponded to all the different color temperatures and color profiles as they changed throughout the day. So I segmented all of the shader stuff into different sections called morning, midday, evening, and night, each with their own gradients, and then hooked up all the transitions between those gradients to a material collection, which I then pumped over to a blueprint that controls the day-night cycle. Then over in that thing, I had to create cascading vectors to drive the interpolations between the gradients, and I had to make sure that they all did so smoothly and intelligently. This is the end result. The image on the left is the default lighting in Unreal, and the image on the right is the modified lighting. Just like in the photograph, they're similar. However, I can tell you that there's a lot more color and value information in the image on the right. The default color settings just go bright and then they stay that way and nothing ever changes. But there is not a single color or value or range in the right that I can't change to be basically anything else. And this was my color pass while I was making the system. I'm super excited to do a formal color overhaul later. So the quest was to make combat. Quest failed. However, along the way, there was a cool side dungeon where I got to breathe color into the game in a really crazy and unique way, and I think I cleared that dungeon pretty nicely. Our Discord is called the Adventurers Lodge, and there's an invite link to it down below. The Adventurers in the Lodge are my patrons. Everything you've seen so far, including the making of this video, is being made extra possible and more possible by them every day. You can sign up to be an adventurer as the links are down below. And I want to deliver some exciting news next week, and the best way to make sure you don't miss it is to subscribe to the channel. As always, I have a stupid amount of work I gotta go do, so I'm gonna go get back to it. I'll see you all down the road.